Ding dong. Hello, everybody. Today I'd like to talk about someone who is based. Based on what? On alchemy. This guy is pretty famous. I think out of all the alchemists, he's probably one of the most famous. Paracelsus, or as his birth name or original name, is Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. Probably the best name. The best, you can imagine why he took the pseudonym Paracelsus instead, much simpler. But nonetheless, Paracelsus is, I think, important to perhaps study. So you can read a lot of his works in there, once again, alchemical and quite impenetrable. But apparently, he didn't actually write that much during his life. And a lot of the books attributed to Paracelsus, what they are he basically dictated teachings to his students and they transcribed them. So a lot of the Paracelsian books are just after his death. His students rushed to the printers and started printing the manuscripts. So there's different, now they've probably all ordered them and sorted them out, but that at a time there would have been the same book under different titles because it would have been slightly different manuscripts, slightly different wording and different things like that. So, okay. So there's this interesting thing with the Paracelsian alchemical system. But his system's interesting. Or at least my simple impression of him, not that I'm a Paracelsian scholar or anything, was he moved more to he was kind of in the middle of the two alchemies, shall we say. So there's one alchemy is material. It's you work with flasks and it's like a proto-chemistry. And there's another type of alchemy that's seen as spiritual, but as a development of man. And of course that dichotomy is a bit wrong anyway, because the alchemists did many different things. Was it wine making, medicine, fortress building, art, music, poetry, magic, mathematics, astrology, etc., 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 etc. But Paracelsus was a bit in the middle of that. He also didn't he wasn't a guy who said, to transmute gold or anything. Because he was a physician, a doctor, and a good doctor apparently. He healed a bunch of people, and the true doctors got mad at him, and he was continuously called a fraud and kicked out of where he was living at the time. But apparently he just didn't care. He just kept moving around. Just didn't care. It was like, okay, fine, I'll leave. Also, another scandalous thing, they call him the Luther of medicine because he would teach in German, not in Latin. And he would tell people not to read the old books, that they should do experiments for themselves. So a proto-scientist, and all very, very interesting guy if you ever read about his life. Very interesting guy, but he was more keenly into medicine and healing and using alchemy for that. And in fact, I believe at one point he says something to the effect of, when it comes to physical alchemy, the only reason you do physical alchemy is to understand how the creator created. Yeah. So his idea was, you just need that qualia, that experience, that direct knowledge of creation. The way, I think he says in one point, it's like, if you want to understand or to extract the highest thing from the physical work, all you need to do is observe the growth of a seed, or the creation of planets, or how an embryo forms in a womb, or the growth of animals, etc., etc. And it's one of those things that's interesting. It's like, what are all of those things? All of those things are life force. So what he's basically saying is he's describing, this is what you should do. You should look at life, observe nature, and she will instruct you about life force. And then magic then is the manipulation of this life force. So it's really interesting. It was really interesting reading Paracelsus, because in reading him, I was like, this is Steiner, this is Franz Button, or this is like the basis of where they get a lot of their stuff from. I remember Steiner in one of his books, the Knowledge of Higher Worlds, one of the practices he gives to awaken clairvoyance is he basically says, he gives a practice to stare at a plant. And he said the exercise is basically like, you get a plant and it's like this big, and you meditate on it, for say an hour or even 10 minutes, something like that, but every single day. And he says over a year that plant will have grown. And although you don't consciously see it growing, like it's very slow when it's growing, but you look at it and then the next day it's slightly bigger, and you may not notice it day by day, but slightly. And then after a while you kind of notice, oh, it has gotten a bit bigger, hasn't it? But even though you don't consciously notice it, all of those stages of growth are in your subconscious. Like different, what do you call it? What's the different, the flip books we made when we were kids with like a person like running or whatever. But it's like a flip book in your subconsciousness. And he says that, you need to do it for at least a year. But basically the effect of this meditation is, pardon me, the effect of that meditation, of meditating on a plant, is you intuitionally gain an understanding of life force and how life force moves. And so when you stare at a plant, you gain an impression of it physically, but you also just have an understanding. You gain something of the invisible part of the plant, the life force of the plant. And he says this, if you've done this practice successfully enough and developed inside you what should be there, is, he said, the ultimate test that this practice has been successful is if you get a seed or another plant, or he said a seed because it's the most simplest, but a seed that's plastic and a seed that's real, that look identical. And, they need to switch them up, and you need to look at them, and physically they'll both look the same, but the invisible part of them will be different. And you'll be able to tell like 100% of the time which has life force and which doesn't. So, and this was his whole kind of shtick for like awakening clairvoyance, is basically if you can begin to sense the invisible part of a physical object, then by that logic, you should be able to sense and feel and interact with something that is invisible but has no physical counterpart. So something that's invisible, has no physical counterpart, but it exists nonetheless. You should be able to interact with that. And I was like, this is amazing. This is really, and the prototype for that is found in, you could say, Paracelsus. That's what he's telling you to do by studying the life force. And he said, by studying the life force, that's what you're doing. Physical alchemy is, and you gain this understanding of life force. And when you gain that, then the internal part happens. And he said, it's very interesting guy. And then of course, I was like, coming off of reading Thomas Vaughan and all of that, there's that whole thing about, is alchemy tantra or not? And then Paracelsus, there's this really interesting thing. It's like, he says, there's some lines he says, like this, the spirit hovers above the like seminal waters and things like that. I was like, oh, this is getting interesting. And then he has this whole kind of like diagram, or not diagram, but you can represent it diagrammatically. But he basically says something like, within us we have the enseminus, of course, the seminal fluid, but we need to extract something out of that. So if you want to see, your eyes need a particular energy. You want to see nature, read nature. I think I've got a quote from Paracelsus about like seeing into nature. Yeah, he says something like, all is nature. Nature is in the universal mind. The universal mind is, or the individual mind, sorry. All is in nature. Nature is in the universal mind. The individual mind is in the universal mind. Therefore, all is not known through books, but through inner sight. And so for him, the true physician was someone who had this inner sight, the true doctor, the true alchemist. So you need to cultivate that. And basically, there's this bit where he kind of goes off and he says, so how do you develop these qualities? Or how do you develop this quality? Well, all the qualities and temperaments of a man can be found in his semen, or the enseminus, the sexual energy. It applies for women as well. But he basically says, it's very interesting. So it's this thing of like, as above, so below. We represent the macrocosmos as a microcosmos, but even just a single part of us has everything in it. like a DNA sample. You don't need, it doesn't necessarily, it can be a skin sample, a hair sample, saliva, it doesn't really matter. You can get the entire DNA scope from any part of us. So all of our qualities and temperaments, he says, are in the enseminis, the seminal liquor, the sexual energy. And then he says, so what do we gotta, what you need is not enseminis, you need aura seminalis. And the aura seminalis is the semen of the mind or the imagination. So he's talking about basically clairvoyance needs energy. It's an energetic system that needs to be developed. And he says, the enseminis is transmuted and turned into liqua vitae, or nerve fluid. And then that further is transmuted into the aura seminalis. And it's like, well, how do you do that? And so he basically has this little thing where he just says, the aura seminalis is separated from the liqua vitae via an act of digestion, or an act similar to digestion, or how smoke is extracted from wood via fire. Or wood is burnt into fire. But basically, and then he just gives it that little hint, and he just says, this process is achieved via contact with women. And then, he just goes off and starts talking about other things. And I was like, very, very interesting. Very interesting. So here, yet again, we have another alchemist talking about philosopher's stones, talking about medicines, perhaps spagyrics and whatnot. And then just right in the middle of his doctrine, he just starts talking about semen and transmutation. It isn't just another thing to drive home that all alchemy and all magic is reconciled via this energy. All energy, all of our thought, our emotions, our motor energy, and even the higher energies that we do use for psychic processes and spirituality, all of it is just a variation of one energy, the sexual energy within us. And so it's another cause. And once again, contact with women. So it's not just a single transmutation. It's contact with women implies sexual magic, implies white tantra. You don't want to lose the semen. He doesn't say to spill it. He says to transmute it, to extract the aura. Because if you lose the aura seminalis, he says, is the enseminis. Yes, the enseminis is the vehicle for the aura seminalis. Sorry, just Latin terms I'm not good with. It's the vehicle for that. So if you lose the enseminis, you lose the aura seminalis. You need to first transmute it out. You need to transmute that out, and that is done through that sexual process of not spilling the seed. Very interesting. Very interesting. So we gain that inner sight, we become real alchemists, and then you could say the major mysteries begin. Then we can truly see, then we can truly operate like that. And then we can truly know things as well. We can know the macrocosmos as well as our microcosmos. And that is really the aim of the game. Right at the end, he talks about the philosopher's stone. Sorry. But yeah, also more than that, he says something like, when he starts talking about planetary intelligences, like, the celestial entities, the Olympic spirits and whatnot, and things like that, he says something like, a planetary spirit is merely a human or a man who has perfect knowledge of themselves. So once again, there's these two things. There is this consciousness, this development of consciousness, of developing of knowledge, and on the other side there's a development of being itself. And the development of being is fundamentally tied to the sexual energy and the development and the energetic working of that, the transmutation of that. That is the internal alchemy. So we need both knowledge and being to develop at the same time. If you just develop being, you're not very useful for humanity. And if you just develop knowledge, you're just an intellectual ignoramus like me. So you need to develop both in tandem with each other. It's a very, very interesting guy. So there's lots of, different books. I think you can get like the complete alchemical works by Paracelsus. It's like another Arthur Edward Waite book. It's like massive. But a really good book that's an introductory to start diving into Paracelsus before going into anything else there's a life of Paracelsus. There's two life of Paracelsuses. One is Life of Paracelsus by Arthur Edward Waite, and then there's the Life of Paracelsus, the substance of his teachings or something like that, and it's written by Franz Hartmann, who was a Rosicrucian and early theosophist. Very important guy in the German esoteric scene. Well, at least back in the day. Not sure how well he's regarded now, but nonetheless, that book, that Life of Paracelsus by Franz Hartmann, that's a good one. You read that, and then you have the kind of the framework to then penetrate his teachings, and then to maybe comprehend some thereof. But reading modern authors, reading a little bit of Steiner, reading a bit of Franz Baden, reading some Samael, things like that also help give that framework to start kind of understanding these alchemists and the mysteries that they've hidden. But nonetheless, I thought that was really interesting. So I thought I'd share with you guys. Share with you guys one of the, probably one of the coolest alchemists. He's very well regarded. He's very well regarded. Anyway, I'll stop taking up your time. Enjoy your weeks. Enjoy your days. Keep meditating. Blah, blah, blah. Develop the Philosopher's Stone. Don't give in to the demiurge. All the good stuff. Bye.